Thank you. It's a delight to be here. I've been here before, and every time I come, the audience seems to get larger, and that's good. And I was about to say that President Obama recently went to a football game, so they awarded him the Heisman Trophy. I always like to start off with a little humor because we're going to get into some very heavy stuff here tonight. But one of the problems that we have in our country is that people don't ask the right questions. Or if they ask the question, they don't ask it the right way. And I heard this about a fellow who's flying around in Ireland in a hot air balloon. And he got lost. He didn't know where he was. Well, he saw a farmer down in the field. So he lowered the thing down and he peed over the side and he said, "Hello, where am I?" Well, the little Irish farmer had never seen this before. So he didn't say anything. The guy again said, "Hello, where am I?" And finally the farmer looked up and he said, "You can't fool me. You're in that little basket up there." He didn't ask the right question. Right? Well, enough of that. We have to move on. Now, as you already know, the title of my talk, Stopping the New World Order, it's actually part 2 of a presentation called Overview of America, and part 1, the previous programs, a 30-minute documentary. It discusses how far from our fundamental roots the nation has been taken. There's about 100,000 copies of Overview of America throughout the country. It's been quite gratifying to me. And it's been stolen by people, put it up on television, on the YouTube and so forth. There were people now even putting it up and claiming it was their program. Imitation is the highest form of flattery, and I think thievery is even more high. Right? But anyhow, we estimate that there's somewhere around 5 million Americans that have seen this program, and it's done an awful lot of good. And it's helped a lot of people to get over the hump about the John Birch Society. So many have asked us why our country has strayed so far after seeing that DVD. And in part 2 of this program, this is what we're here for tonight. We intend to answer these very reasonable questions. There is the Overview of America, part 1. And these are the questions that have to be answered. Why has America left its roots? Who's to blame? What can be done? The initial overview program showed how our nation was launched on the self-evident truth that God gave us our rights and that governments are formed to protect those rights and nothing more. And after declaring independence, the men who built the American system purposely went ahead and put together the U.S. Constitution. And they built a republic and not a democracy. And we go into that at length in this DVD. And that's a very important subject. And a lot of people are absolutely stunned. And youngsters who have seen the program will look at their father and say, "That's not what they're teaching us in school." And Dad will say, "Good, I'm glad you realize that." Right? The rule of a majority under a democracy always degenerates into mob rule and eventual tyranny. The founding fathers of our country vociferously attacked the very idea of democracy. We then discussed the political spectrum that proceeds from total government on the extreme left, communism, socialism, Nazism, fascism, to no government on the right, anarchy. And those who believe in the American system will reject both the left and the right and choose limited government. They and we are constitutional moderates. And I've been on radio shows and I've told people I'm not a leftist or a rightist, I'm a moderate. And the guy said, "You're John Birch Society? You're claiming to be moderate?" In the political spectrum, yes. We believe in the middle. And we also defined in this DVD, the Overview of America, we defined capital as the means of production and made the logical conclusion that ultimately there are only 2 kinds of economic systems. The first is free enterprise capitalism, where you have private ownership, control, and use of the means of production. And the second is monopolistic capitalism, where the government taxes, controls, and regulates the means of production. Now, these concepts are not very difficult to grasp. In fact, junior high school students can grasp it and do when they see it. But most Americans don't consider these concepts because the schools don't teach what the founders so wisely created. The politicians continuously skirt the basic principles of Americanism, and the mass media regularly ignores historical truths while promoting out-and-out falsehoods. Widespread confusion, skillfully created distortion, deliberately designed deception, it's all there. It reigns in our country, the land of the free and the home of the brave. Our nation is being steered headlong into total government by leaders, all of whom solemnly swear an oath to abide by the Constitution and then proceed as if the document doesn't even exist. Who do we blame for that? We blame ourselves for allowing it to happen. Right? We got to stop allowing it to happen. If we don't soon force our leaders to reverse course, we will lose the nation, and our personal freedom will be canceled. The reality is that there's a war going on. It's not a war fought with guns and tanks and ships, the usual kind of war. The war we're in is one of freedom versus government control, independence versus world government, the long continued struggle of the forces of good versus the forces of evil. In other words, a different kind of war. Several centuries before Christ, a philosopher who was also a military strategist gave the world a great deal of wisdom. His thoughts wound up in a small book called The Art of War. His name was Sun Tzu, the Chinese genius. I choose to focus only on one of his many summary statements about war. He said, if you know the enemy and you know yourself, you need not fear the results of 100 battles. We Americans know ourselves, but most do not know our enemy. Most do not know that this enemy is within and that it has great power over what is happening in our nation. Sun Tzu also said all warfare is based on deception. If an enemy who seeks to control your life and gain control over your country can persuade you that he's acting in your best interests, he has performed a superb act of deception. We need to know our enemy if we're going to stop him, and we need to pierce his carefully built wall of deception. There are numerous serious problems facing our country. Let me list a few. Here we have the Education Department. The U.S. government began involvement in education in the 1950s and greatly expanded its presence with the Department of Education in the 1970s. Countless billions of dollars have been spent, and the performance of the schools continues to decline. Their sinking quality is approximately inversely proportional to how much money has been spent. The more money that goes in, the worse the quality. Right? But federal dominance in education continues. Here's the Department of Housing and Urban Development. It began in the 1960s. Its role in the recent housing fiasco that ushered in the severe economic recession cannot be denied. But its multi-billion-dollar budget continues. We list here Fannie Mae. That's one of many organizations that should have been allowed to fail. Okay? It should have been gone. Well, then we go to the Department of Energy. In the 1970s, great attention was given to the discovery that our nation was importing 30% of our oil. So the Carter administration and a compliant Congress spent tens of billions annually and created numerous controls over the energy producers. 30 years later, our nation no longer imports 30% of our oil. We import 60% of our oil. Right? Yet if government would get out of the way and let the energy producers tap the abundant resources within our own territory, our nation wouldn't have to import a drop of oil. So how did we arrive at this point? Well, there's no authorization in the U.S. Constitution for the 3 cabinet-level positions I've just mentioned. Yet they not only continue their negative impact, they add substantially to our nation's frightening indebtedness. Each, like several other unconstitutional departments, should be abolished. But each wins more funding and does more harm every single year. So how did we arrive at this point? Well, the steady drift of our toward total government that we've barely touched upon results mainly from only one of 3 possible causes. It could be caused by evolutionary history that nobody can stop. Or it could be caused by mistakes that our leaders are making because they just don't have enough information or they haven't figured it out. Or it could be deliberate action. It could be the work of determined individuals who intend to destroy our nation and lead us into world government, a new world order. The John Birch Society rejects the evolutionary unfolding of history explanation because we are not Marxists who believe in economic determinism. We believe instead that history is almost always made by a dedicated few for good or for evil. And we do not believe our leaders, both in government and elsewhere, are bumbling fools and ignoramuses who pile mistake upon mistake. This leaves us with the third explanation, that the steady transformation of our free enterprise republic into a totalitarian nightmare results from the work of some determined individuals. In a word, we believe America's steep decline and government's enormous growth have been deliberately arranged, and the word is conspiracy. A conspiracy actively working to seize total power, and the way to combat a conspiracy is to expose it. A brilliant man once summarized, the first job of conspiracy is to convince the world that conspiracy does not exist. And there's a lot of people that help the conspirators in making sure that the world does not even believe that it exists. The soundness of that short epigram can be gauged in part by the intensity of campaigns to discount any hint of conspiracy as the root cause of America's problems. Now, you're allowed to discuss a mafia conspiracy. Likewise, it's permissible to speak about the Watergate conspiracy or some locally created conspiracy. But any suggestion that a conspiratorial clique has a grip on our government, on the mass media, and other critical segments of our nation's life brings immediate retaliation, ridicule, even occasional character assassination. Conspirators and their defenders will go to great lengths to guarantee that the existence of their plot remains hidden. But what is a conspiracy? Simply stated, it's an endeavor engaged in secretly by two or more persons for an evil purpose. Secrecy, more than one person, evil, that's conspiracy. Those who adamantly discount conspiracy have to rewrite history because history is full of it. Working to destroy freedom while building total government certainly fits the definition of evil, and those who label for such a goal while protesting that they are busily doing good for mankind are certainly not stupid. The nation's first Secretary of Defense back in 1948, a man named James Forrestal, he put the stupidity notion to rest when he stated in 1948, "Consistency has never been the mark of stupidity. If the diplomats who have mishandled our relations with Russia were merely stupid, they would occasionally make a mistake in our favor." Very well put. Very well put. Those who seek total government power are consistent, not stupid. But while we maintain that a conspiracy exists, we don't want to create a wrong impression about it and how it works. Not everyone who champions big government or world government or who attacks the people's freedom is a signed, sealed, and delivered conspirator. No, no. Most of the work of the conspiracy is carried out by self-serving individuals whose sole goal is personal advancement. The conspiracy's success stems from a determined few at its core who use their great wealth and power to reward an array of self-promoting individuals. They shower favors on those who carry out their wishes. Attention and rewards are provided for those who repeat what could be considered the correct attitudes, or who support the correct programs, or who attack the correct targets, right? And those who do not engage in destructive political correctness are shunned. This is why morality is such a key in combating a conspiracy. Moral people can't be bought with money, elevated appointments, assistance in getting elected, other favors. No, no. Moral people won't allow themselves to be sucked in like that. Top conspirators seek out those who display an ambitious willingness to cast aside moral concerns. Moral decline has always been the chief problem facing our nation or any nation. Too many have discarded right and wrong in favor of what's in it for me, no matter how destructive that choice may be for the rest of mankind. These are the individuals who are sought out by a conspiracy. They are the busy workers who help the enemy achieve its destructive goals. Morality the key? John Adams, Vice President of Washington, second President of the United States. Look what he said. Our Constitution was made for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Very well put. Right. Now, for an example of how the conspiracy works, consider a man named Alan Greenspan. In 1967, he authored an essay entitled Capitalism, the Unknown Ideal. In it, he stated the following undeniable truth. He said, in the absence of the gold standard, there is no way to protect savings from confiscation through inflation. There is no safe store of value. Alan Greenspan was right on, as they say. He knew that inflation is actually an increase in the quantity of currency that steals the value of all existing currency and enables government to fund all its dangerous programs. Inflation is not rising prices. The rising prices are the effect. In other words, he knew that the gold standard enjoyed by our nation until 1933 both protected savings and simultaneously kept government growth to a minimum. But Greenspan's attitude in 1967 didn't win him favor with those who seek to have the government confiscate the American people's wealth and completely alter our system of government. So he started singing a different tune. 11 years after he had correctly written about the value of the gold standard and the destructiveness of inflation, Greenspan accepted membership in the Council on Foreign Relations, the main seat of conspiratorial power in our nation. Before another decade had elapsed, he won a place in the conspiracy's higher echelon by being named chairman of the Federal Reserve. The Fed, as many Americans are beginning to realize, and that's a very good development, right, is the chief engine for creating inflation in our nation and the chief opponent of any return to a gold standard. And by completely reversing his attitude, Greenspan earned his reward. Now, there are many others in government and in the media and the corporate world and the foundations and clergy and academia, even in the military, who spread erroneous information and implement harmful policies in order to promote themselves. These individuals, like Greenspan, didn't start out as conspirators, but become conspiracy's willing servants in order to receive the rewards they know are available if they play along. When Greenspan won elevation to membership in the Council on Foreign Relations, its chairman was David Rockefeller. There is no person more justifiably identified as a conspiracy policy setter than David Rockefeller. He certainly has the ability to reward those who are willing to carry forward the conspiracy's destructive agenda. He spent a lifetime using his enormous wealth to support organizations and policies that are harmful to the best interests of our nation and people. And he even admitted this in his 2002 autobiography entitled Memoirs. Pointing to himself and his family, he wrote, "Some even believe we are part of a secret cabal working against the best interests of the United States, characterizing my family and me as internationalists and of conspiring with others around the world to build a more integrated global political and economic structure. One world, if you will." And he continued, "If that's the charge, I stand guilty and I'm proud of it." Thank you for a burst of honesty, Mr. David Rockefeller. David Rockefeller is proud of being part of a secret cabal. He's proud of working against the best interests of the United States. He's proud of conspiring, he used the word, with others around the world to build a world government. Are there others who pointed to a conspiracy at work over the years? Many, many. The answer is yes. Over the years, numerous individuals have discovered the existence of conspiratorial activity within our nation and tried to expose it. J. Edgar Hoover ran the Federal Bureau of Investigation for quite a long time. In 1954, he wrote an article for the Elks magazine, and in it he said, "Yet the individual is handicapped by coming face to face with a conspiracy so monstrous he cannot believe it exists." Ladies and gentlemen, a conspiracy will rely on such a handicap facing the people that it wants to control. Hoover continued, "The American mind simply has not come to a realization of the evil which has been introduced into our midst." So he was one. Earlier, in 1949, a Supreme Court justice named Robert Jackson labeled the Communist Party a conspiratorial and revolutionary junta. And the Senate Internal Security Subcommittee put out an extensive report in 1953 and referred to the communist threat as a conspiracy and emphasized that it was a severe hazard to our nation's security. In his 1962 book, Barry Goldwater was still a senator from Arizona. He said, "Communism is an international criminal conspiracy." Right? I'm emphasizing the word conspiracy because these other people said it. Then we have Ezra Taft Benson. He was the Secretary of Agriculture, all during the Eisenhower years. In 1963, he gave a speech and he said, "Communism in its unmistakable reality is wholly a conspiracy, a gigantic conspiracy to enslave mankind, an increasingly successful conspiracy controlled by determined and utterly ruthless gangsters." I wonder what he really meant. That's pretty tough. But there were always some who saw that communism was not just the whole program, that more than communism was at the root of the world conspiracy. In the late 1940s, a courageous woman named Bella Dodd defected from the high post she held in the U.S. Communist Party. After years of having believed that she was doing good work in the party and helping mankind, she broke away and she stated, "I think the communist conspiracy is merely a branch of a much bigger conspiracy." And she wasn't alone in looking more deeply into the actual source of America's problems. By 1966, Robert Welch, who founded the John Birch Society, stated in a comprehensive report, "The communist movement is only a tool of the total conspiracy." What led him to say that was he knew that the Bolsheviks in Russia had been helped into power in 1917 by diplomatic and financial help from non-communists in the West. He showed with mounds of evidence that the U.S. aid had for decades built the Soviet industries and saved the Kremlin from internal collapse. He told all who would listen about the steady stream of U.S. supplied sustenance going to the Soviet Union that had created a frightening and powerful adversary. And he even pointed out that the threat posed by communism had given the government the excuse to concentrate more power at the federal level. Robert Welch didn't attribute this and many other developments to stupidity, but to the plans of a 200-year-old conspiracy known to history as the Bavarian Illuminati, a plot created by an evil genius named Adam Weishaupt. Robert Welch had put his finger on the real enemy. He knew himself, as Sun Tzu had counseled, but he also knew his enemy. And the enemy Robert Welch pointed to is our enemy as well. Over the years, many voices have warned of this centuries-old world conspiracy. In its June 19, 1920 feature editorial, the Christian Science Monitor raised the alarm. After pointing to numerous examples of world turbulence at that point in history, the editorialist wrote, "What is important to dwell upon is the increasing evidence of the existence of a secret conspiracy throughout the world for the destruction of organized government and the letting loose of evil." And that editorialist pointed to the outpourings of Adam Weishaupt and the Illuminati. Also in 1920, a rising young political figure in England named Winston Churchill identified this same Illuminati as the seat of a conspiracy seeking world power. He wrote in the February 1920 edition of London's Illustrated Sunday Herald. He said, from the days of Spartacus Weishaupt to those of Karl Marx and down to Trotsky, this worldwide conspiracy for the overthrow of civilization has been steadily growing. 1920. Churchill continued his comments about the Illuminati conspiracy. It has been the mainspring of every subversive movement during the 19th century, and now at last this band of extraordinary personalities from the underworld of the great cities of Europe and America have gripped the Russian people. He claimed that the takeover of Russia was the work of the Illuminati. In 1953, California's Senate Committee on Education issued a document entitled the Dilworth Report, which stated, so-called modern communism is apparently the same hypocritical and deadly world conspiracy to destroy mankind that was founded by the secret order of the Illuminati in Bavaria on May 1st of 1776, and that raised its hoary head in our colonies at critical periods before the adoption of our federal Constitution. Robert Welch launched the Birch Society in 1958, always warning about the existence of a conspiracy to rule mankind. He too pointed to the Illuminati founded in Bavaria, May 1st, 1776. And in 1967, the John Birch Society published English professor John Robeson's important 1798 book exposing the Illuminati conspiracy. Entitled Proofs of a Conspiracy, Robeson's book supplied details about the strategy and tactics of the plotters who had already destroyed the French monarchy and had set their sights on other governments. Their goal was nothing less than the creation of a totalitarian world government. And by bringing this book to the attention of current Americans, the John Birch Society has helped to show many that what our nation is facing today was precisely what had been created by Weishaupt almost 200 years earlier. Always warning about the existence of a conspiracy to rule mankind, Robert Welch again summarized its activities in 1972. He said, the plan is to establish the first stages of a new world order. This will be the Novus Ordo Seclorum, for which a self-perpetuating inner circle of conspirators have been working and scheming relentlessly during some 6 generations. From the time he said that, go back 6 generations, and you arrive at 1776 and the creation of the Illuminati. The Illuminati's founding on May 1st of 1776 is significant because communists and socialists worldwide for 200 years have celebrated May 1st as their May Day. Right? And only a very few realize that the choice of May Day stems from the date that the Illuminati formally launched their drive to create the New World Order. The phrase New World Order has long been employed by conspirators and their willing adherents to summarize their twin goals: political subjugation through world government and economic control through socialism. The Latin phrase Novus Ordo Seclorum, appearing on the $1 bill, is actually part of the Great Seal of the United States. It means literally New Order of the Ages and has been more freely translated as New World Order. The seal, created by the Continental Congress in 1782, gives evidence that there were conspiratorial influences within our infant nation even then. References to the phrase have repeatedly been issued by many individuals who know its significance. They used that phrase, New World Order, to signal their awareness of the conspiracy's existence and their willingness to carry out its designs. Now, if you know Roman numbers, you can look at the bottom of the pyramid on your dollar bill, and you'll add them up, and it comes to 1776. Is it 4th of July, 1776? Or is it May 1st, 1776? Well, you know what I think. I think it was May 1st. Right? So, New World Order has been a phrase that tips people off. I'm in on the plan. I want to be in on the plan. In 1920, there was a book published called The New World Order by a professor at Columbia University. Notice that he called for international law. Frederick Charles Hicks did. As he started off his run for the president in 1967, Richard Nixon called for the evolution of a new world order. In an article he wrote for the Council on Foreign Relations publication, Foreign Affairs, he signaled his willingness to work with the world government crowd. When he sought the presidency in 1968, Nelson Rockefeller said he wished to build a new world order. Throughout his life, Nelson Rockefeller did everything he could to build a world government at the expense of our nation's independence. In 1975, scores of members of Congress added their names to a resolution seeking to bring forth a new world order. After exposure of this obviously subversive plan that included transfer of our sovereignty to the United Nations, many of the signers in Congress removed their names, and the plan to convert the resolution into law died. One of the little triumphs of the John Birch Society, by the way. In 1979, Cuba's communist dictator Fidel Castro demanded the creation of a new world order. He knew, even if most Americans did not know, that he had been helped into power and kept in power by conspiratorial forces within the U.S. government. In 1990, the unrepentant communist Mikhail Gorbachev labeled the New World Order as his goal. They invited him to speak before the Congress of the United States. He should have been put in jail. Later in 1990, President George H.W. Bush repeatedly employed the phrase and always linked it to the United Nations. The UN, of course, is to be the seat of the world government, long sought by the conspiracy. Mr. Bush stated in one of his pronouncements, "Out of these troubled times, our fifth objective, a new world order, can emerge. We are now in sight of a United Nations that performs as envisioned by its founders." We'll get to its founders shortly. And in 1991, as he prepared to send U.S. forces into Iraq while citing a UN Security Council resolution for authorization, Mr. Bush announced, "I think that what's at stake here is the New World Order, a reinvigorated United Nations." For more than 200 years, many individuals have worked for the twin goals sought by the conspiracy: world government and socialist domination. The reward for them did not consist in completely reaching these goals. Their reward instead was in the making. They received prominent positions. They were rewarded with personal wealth. They were favored by allies in the government and in the media. In a worldly sense, they had succeeded. That their country and their fellow citizens suffered was of little consequence to them. Let's quickly summarize some of what we've mentioned here. The 1920 Christian Science Monitor editorial said that world problems at that point in history were the product of the Illuminati conspiracy. Winston Churchill blamed every subversive movement during the 19th century on this same conspiracy. He concluded that the communist takeover of Russia in 1917 was the work of the Illuminati conspiracy. The California Department of Education put out its Dilworth report, noting that the Illuminati conspiracy had acquired some influence in our nation during its infancy. Robert Welch in 1972 said, "A self-perpetuating inner circle of conspirators has been working and scheming relentlessly during some 6 generations. 6 generations, as I mentioned, takes us back to what we've already mentioned. The creation of the Order of the Illuminati, May 1st, 1776. If we look at the present, we see the Vice President of our nation and the Obama administration favoring a new world order. He actually authored this article, Joseph Biden did, "How I Learned to Love the New World Order." All right. Well, here's Adam Weishaupt. The man was a brilliant organizer. The 18th century in which he lived had already suffered from criminal activity of minor conspiratorial groups. After studying their history and learning from their somewhat successes and mostly failures, Weishaupt created the Illuminati with a system of concentric circles of power and influence where knowledge of the ultimate goal was given only to a few in the conspiracy's innermost chambers. Advancement towards this elevated core was granted only to the most ambitious and cunning of Weishaupt's recruits. He once boasted that he could set 1,000 men in motion by issuing directives to a mere 6 of his most trusted followers. The final goal of the Illuminati was world rule. To accomplish this enormously ambitious and deadly undertaking, Weishaupt launched attacks on all existing institutions. He sought the overthrow of governments, destroy all religion, abolish private property, deify sensuality, repudiate marriage, state control of children, leading to world government. Weishaupt's agents soon gained control of continental European Freemasonry at the Congress of Wilhelmsbad in 1782. Illuminized Masonry spread like wildfire throughout many nations. In 1784, however, an Illuminist courier in Bavaria was killed by a bolt of lightning. Among the dead man's possessions, local authorities found several documents heavily incriminating the order. Bavarian authorities then prohibited association with the Illuminati under penalty of death. And so Weishaupt fled Bavaria to northern Germany, where he continued to direct the conspiracy. It was Illuminists who brought about the disastrous French Revolution in 1789, from which France has never recovered. When news of the revolt in France reached America, some here greeted it with great joy, believing that a duplication of our nation's successful struggle for independence had been created. Attempts were made by Illuminist influences to steer our infant nation into copying France's convulsions, but these were blocked by Washington and Adams and others. The previously cited Christian Science Monitor editorial of 1920 pointed to John Robeson's 1798 book, Proofs of a Conspiracy. Simultaneous with the publication of that remarkable work came the same year publication of Abbé Augustin Baruel's 4-volume study entitled Memoirs Illustrating the History of the Jacobinisms. Working independently without ever having met, these two men reached the same dire assessment of the threat to civilization posed by the Order of the Illuminati. Shortly after he retired as president in 1797, George Washington received a copy of Robeson's book. He received it from the Reverend George Schneider of Fredericktown, Maryland. In a letter thanking the Reverend, Washington stated, "Reverend Sir, it was not my intention to doubt that the doctrine of the Illuminati had not spread in the United States. On the contrary, no one is more satisfied of this fact than I am." And before he died in 1799, Washington wrote again about his concerns regarding the conspiracy. This other letter, reproduced in this book entitled New England and the Bavarian Illuminati, that was published in 1918, that letter thanked Reverend Jedediah Morse of Boston for sending information about the Illuminati. Warnings then supplied by Washington and others about the penetration of our nation by this well-organized and dangerous plot helped to keep its influence in our country to a bare minimum. But the dangers it posed to our nation and to civilization would continue in the years ahead. Illuminism spawned parallel organizations in other countries, the most significant being the Italian Carbonari, soon led by a revolutionary young firebrand named Giuseppe Mazzini. The Carbonari's highest lodge, known as the Alta Vendita, was named as, quote, the immediate successor of the inner circle of Weishaupt by Monsignor George Dillon in his 1885 survey of the conspiracy entitled The War of Antichrist with the Church. In this important work, the Scottish scholar clergyman exposed the Alta Vendita's plans to infiltrate and neutralize the Catholic Church, its most formidable enemy. Giuseppe Mazzini created a group known as Young Italy, which later merged with the Carbonari. He soon led both. In time, other young groups were formed. There was Young Poland, Young Germany, Young France, Young England, Young Ireland, and Young America. The ultimate goal of all of them was always world government. And in 1847, Mazzini went to London, where he teamed up with Karl Marx. While few have ever heard of Giuseppe Mazzini, many have some knowledge of Marx. With his patron, Friedrich Engels, Marx affiliated with the German branch of the League of the Just, a group that soon changed its name to the Communist League. The League, believed by competent historians to have been an outgrowth of the Illuminati, sought to unite the continent's numerous socialist factions under a common manifesto. The task of producing the document fell to Marx and Engels, and they issued the famous Communist Manifesto in 1848. But neither was named as its author in the initial publication, as can be seen in this title page from the original edition. It's in German. Right at the top it says Manifest der Kommunistischen Partei, the manifesto of the Communist Party. You don't see Marx or Engels' name on the cover. Engels would later reveal that he and Marx wanted to label the document the Socialist Manifesto, but decided that the Communist Manifesto was a better name because socialism was being perceived by many as middle-class movement, not a product of the working class. It is still the guide for socialism and communism worldwide. The manifesto boldly calls for doing away with private property, abolishing the family, separating children from parents, replacing homeschool with state-run institutions, doing away with marriage, overthrowing governments, eradicating countries and nationalities, terminating religion and religious-based morality. The final result would be world government. Revealingly, the manifesto also favored democracy. And it lays out its famous 10 planks, each of which have been partially or fully fastened on our nation in the 20th century. Among these goals sought by Marx are land controls, graduated income tax, abolition of the rights of inheritance, monopoly control of banking and credit, you know where that is, education for all children in government schools. Anyone who has studied the Communist Manifesto can readily conclude that our nation is being made over into a Marxist state. And it's not happening by chance. It's Weishaupt all over again. Now, we can't cover all advances towards the conspiracy's goals in this short program, and there are many more. But we jump ahead. We jump ahead to the Woodrow Wilson administration and his top aide, Edward Mandell House. It is this man who could be labeled as 20th century's arch conspirator. The book, Philip Drew Administrator, carried no author's name and was not widely distributed. It contained the desires for America and the world of its actual author, however, Edward Mandell House. It was he who played such an important role in first selecting and then tutoring President Woodrow Wilson during Wilson's 2 terms, 1913 to 1921. In the book, House stated openly that he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. He said that in his own book. Right? Accordingly, he advocated imposing an income tax and creating a central bank, 2 of the key planks of Marx's Communist Manifesto. They were both fastened on our nation in 1913. House further sought to downgrade the U.S. Constitution, empower an imperial president, and lead all nations into submission to a world government. When his hopes for U.S. entry into the League of Nations were dashed by the U.S. Senate in 1919, Woodrow Wilson and House got together, and they eventually formed the Council on Foreign Relations. Woodrow Wilson was not House's only disciple. The mentor of Wilson also mentored Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And while House didn't place his own name on Philip Drew Administrator, his authorship was made known. It is also highly significant that he placed a dedicatory quote on an early page of his revealing book, a statement from the writings of previously mentioned leader of the Carbonari, Giuseppe Mazzini. Conspiracy? What else should it be called? It is highly significant that he chose a statement from Mazzini to put in his own book right at the beginning. Though actually created by a largely deceived Congress in 1913, the Federal Reserve was conceived in 1910 at an intensely secret gathering of 7 bankers and government officials at Jekyll Island in Georgia. New York banker Frank Vanderlip, one of the participants, eventually wrote about the secret meeting in a book. It was serialized in the Saturday Evening Post. Vanderlip stated, "There was an occasion near the close of 1910 when I was as secret, indeed as furtive, as any conspirator." He used the word. The Federal Reserve Act was then deceitfully ushered through Congress in 1913 with claims that it was a measure designed to rein in the money trust, the very opposite of its really intended effect. Its main author, Paul Warburg, was among the 7 who met at Jekyll Island. Edward Mandell House's own biographer said that House not only guided President Wilson's understanding of the Federal Reserve Act, but that he was the unseen guardian angel of the bill. What was produced became the privately owned, non-governmental entity given illegitimate power to be the controller of banking and the engine of confiscatory inflation in our country. The Fed has presided over the loss of 95% of the value of U.S. currency. It continues to resist scrutiny as it works to destroy free enterprise in America. The history of the Federal Reserve, from its origins at Jekyll Island to its continued dominance over the economic life of our nation, reeks of conspiracy. Lenin and Trotsky created the communist state in Russia in 1917. They were helped into power by bankers in Germany and in the United States. Lenin was aided in going from Switzerland to Russia through Germany and given money provided by the House of Rothschild. Trotsky proceeded from New York through Canada with money provided by Jacob Schiff, a relative of the Rothschilds. But an interesting thing happened. The ship transporting Trotsky stopped in Canada. Canadian authorities boarded the vessel and seized Trotsky. They did so because the man had made clear his intention to take Russia out of World War I, then raging. Had he been able to do so, the Canadians theorized, that would have meant more German troops to move from the Eastern Front to the Western Front, where they could have killed more Canadians. And so they arrested Trotsky. But pressure from the United States, applied by Edward Mandell House, forced the Canadians to release the Russian revolutionary, and with the funds supplied to him by anti-communist leaders and the diplomatic assistance supplied by President Wilson's top advisor, Lenin and Trotsky did get together in Russia, did establish a communist base of power, and countless millions became their victims. Conspiracy? How else to explain it? In 1932, Communist Party National Chairman William Z. Foster authored a book entitled Towards Soviet America. Full of recommendations about steps needed to communize our nation, the book contained the following revealing directive. He said, among the elementary measures the American Soviet government will adopt to further the Cultural Revolution are the following. The schools, colleges, and universities will be coordinated and grouped under a National Department of Education and its state and local branches. The studies will be revolutionized, being cleansed of religious, patriotic, and other features of the bourgeois ideology. Ladies and gentlemen, that has happened. In 1980, President Carter and Congress approved creation of the Department of Education, just as Foster had urged years before. They did so despite the absence of any congressional authority to involve the federal government in education, and also despite attempts made by the John Birch Society members throughout the country to warn federal officials about whose program Congress was being asked to implement. Federal dominance over education has proven to be enormously costly and has led to its downward spiral in quality. And the schools of America have been almost completely cleansed of any religious or patriotic instruction. Conspiracy? What else? What else could it be called? The approval of the United Nations Charter by the U.S. Senate in 1945 provided legal justification for our nation to join the world body, created largely by Russian communist Andrei Gromyko and America's Alger Hiss. The charter was read by very few senators prior to their action. No one disputed the fact that Gromyko was a communist, but few knew at the time that Hiss was a secret member of the U.S. Communist Party. The U.S. delegation at the UN's founding San Francisco conference had Hiss for its leader, and 17 other individuals who were later identified in sworn testimony before official government bodies as communists. In addition, there were 43 others in the U.S. delegation who were or soon would become members of the World Government Promoting Council on Foreign Relations. Approved by the Senate and supported by a great majority of the American people who were sick of war, the UN continues to threaten the independence of our nation and all nations. So there's the answer. Get us out of the United Nations, and while you're at it, get the United Nations out of our country. By 1948, a remorseful Senator Robert Taft of Ohio, who had voted for U.S. entry into the world body in 1945, ruefully announced, "The UN is a trap, let's go it alone." Conspiracy? Is it not accurate to state that America was being led into a trap by individuals secretly posing as peace advocates and patriots? Right? Another of Edward Mandell House's plans for America, noted in his book, Philip Drew, Administrator, called for the creation of a Social Security system. Franklin Delano Roosevelt received a copy of the House book from his own mother in 1920, so the future president was well aware of its contents. Immediately after he secured the Democrat Party's nomination in 1932, Roosevelt journeyed to Gloucester, Massachusetts, to visit an old man at his summer residence, Edward Mandell House, the first person he went to see after he won the nomination in 1932. It's certainly significant that that very first person was the individual who had written that he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. Once in the White House, FDR led in creating the Social Security system. For all of its years, Social Security has claimed the existence of a trust fund into which Americans are forced to send some of their earnings. But there is no such fund. There never has been any. In 1937, the Supreme Court ruled in Helvering versus Davis that all taxes collected by the Social Security Agency are to be paid into the Treasury like any other revenue generally and are not earmarked in any way. There never has been a trust fund. It's an immense Ponzi scheme. We said that years ago, and people said, "What's a Ponzi scheme?" Everybody knows today. What is that fellow Madoff? M-A-D-E-O-F-F. he made off, right? And it was Roosevelt who, after being warned in the late 1930s about the penetration of thousands of communists into our own government, angrily told Congressman Martin Dies of Texas, "Several of the best friends I've got are communists. There's no menace here of communism. There's nothing wrong with the communists in this country." And it was Roosevelt who, in 1942, launched the drive to create the United Nations, the world government sought by Edward Mandell House. Conspiracy? I don't know how else to explain it. The U.S. Constitution authorizes Congress to create a military arm. Its purpose can be nothing more than the protection of the lives, liberty, and property of the American people who pay for it. But the Constitution explicitly requires a formal declaration of war by Congress before America's forces can be sent into battle. Many Americans know that such a formal declaration was issued on December 8th, 1941, when Congress declared war on Japan after the attack on Pearl Harbor. World War II, fought on 2 continents, ended in U.S. victory 3.5 years later. But subsequent conflicts, none of which began with the required declaration of war, have produced totally different results and countless thousands of casualties. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, was fought under direct UN control with no declaration of war, victory denied. Throughout the conflict, U.S. commanders wondered how the communist enemy seemed always to know in advance how our forces would conduct operations. Where do you suppose the enemy got the information? From the United Nations. Though an armistice of sorts was declared in 1953, the Korean War has never been ended. The term stalemate is the best that can be said for it. We still have upwards of 30,000 troops stationed in South Korea. That war has never been ended. The Vietnam War, waged under authorization supplied by a UN subsidiary known as SEATO, S-E-A-T-O, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization. No declaration of war, and it ended in defeat. Desert Storm, the first invasion of Iraq in 1991. It received its authorization from another UN Security Council resolution. It ended with Saddam Hussein still in power because the UN supplied authorization allowed only removing Saddam Hussein's forces from Kuwait. And that's why they stopped. The UN is directing our military. Wars against Iraq and Afghanistan. Well, we did it. They're on there. Another UN Security Council resolution authorized the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and action against Afghanistan is being conducted currently under authorization supplied by the other UN subsidiary, NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. I sometimes wonder how they can say North Atlantic Treaty Organization for Afghanistan. Somehow it's not next to the North Atlantic. Ladies and gentlemen, this is the United Nations, and this is what we have to get out of. And here's a statement that summarizes what's going on. Robert Welch many times said, war always means more government and moral decline. 2 extremely important gains for a conspiracy. We have to wonder at this point where the next war might be. We have to wonder. We hope we can stop it before it starts. America is turning over its military arm to the United Nations, has been doing so for quite a few years, and we're ceding our independence to the world body. And I call it a conspiracy. Foreign aid, all of which has always been given to governments and never to individuals except through their governments. It's nowhere authorized by the U.S. Constitution. In 1982, Senator Jesse Helms obtained a study from the Library of Congress showing that the cost of an array of foreign aid programs, counting interest on money borrowed to pay for them, had already reached $2.3 trillion. 1982. No further figures have ever been forthcoming. And yet, while admitting that the federal deficit for its first fiscal year would exceed $1.4 trillion, the Obama administration still intends to give away more than $50 billion in foreign aid, and Congress will dutifully approve such a plan. Now, I contend if you go to a fourth grader and you say, if you're heavily in debt, should you give away money, the fourth grader would say no. Do we need fourth graders in Congress? Yes. We wouldn't be worse off. Over many years, foreign aid has been doled out to oil-rich OPEC nations and an assortment of primitive nations whose leaders delight in hurling insults at the United States. It's been provided to both sides in regional wars. and to governments whose policies stymie progress sought by productive citizens in their own countries. All foreign aid should be terminated because its major effect has been to bleed the American people of their hard-earned wealth and to lead our nation into bankruptcy. This is more evidence of conspiratorial action masquerading as worldwide benevolence, and I call it conspiracy. There are numerous other indications of conspiracy. Occasionally, however, someone with access to information from inside this plot bears its plans. Perhaps the most revealing example we can cite is the work of Georgetown University's Dr. Carroll Quigley, whose lengthy Tragedy and Hope book saw publication in 1966. No opponent of what he chronicled, he wrote about a secret network operating both in the US and Europe to control the world. He supplied details about the plans to build a world government hatched by prominent British and American leaders in the late 19th century. Their efforts led to the formation of internationalist organizations in their respective countries. The British formed the Royal Institute for International Affairs, and the Americans, led by Edward Mandell House, formed the Council on Foreign Relations. According to Professor Quigley, the ultimate goal of these individuals was nothing less than to create a world system of financial control in private hands, able to dominate the political system of each country and the economy of the world as a whole. What an ambitious undertaking. Do you smell Federal Reserve in that? I sure do. The Georgetown professor added that their work would be carried out by secret agreements. The system was to be controlled in feudalistic fashion by the central banks of the world, acting in concert by secret agreements and conferences. The apex of the system was to be a private bank owned and controlled by the world's central banks. It's hardly excessive to point to the Bilderberger meetings, the Trilateral Commission convocations, assemblages of the G20 groups, recent one here in Pittsburgh this year, 2009, the news headline came across, New World Order Emerging at the G20 Summit. Secret gatherings, invitation only, press barred. Powerful leaders of nations meet behind closed doors to steer mankind into the New World Order. But the word is getting out. A lot of people are beginning to understand. They're beginning to know that there is such a thing as the Trilateral Commission and the Bilderberger movement and this G20 thing going on and secret meetings and conferences and so forth. Toward the end of his book, Quigley addressed the need to make our nation's two dominant political parties more international and almost identical. He actually wrote in his book, he said, the two parties should be almost identical so that the American people can throw the rascals out at any election without leading to any profound or extensive shifts in policy. Does that sound like something that's been happening? Right? He continued, it should be possible to replace it every 4 years if necessary by the other party, which will still pursue with new vigor approximately the same basic policies. Right? I'm sometimes asked if we need a third political party. I say, no, we need a second. Now, that's not true down at the local level, at the congressional level. You can have a distinction there, but at the top, not for a long, long time. What Quigley said is what has happened, but men and women can still be elected under the banner of either national party, and they can serve, as all should serve, with firm adherence to the strictures in the Constitution. There are approximately 4,500 members of the Council on Foreign Relations. They include the top leaders of government, the corporate world, the mass media, foundations, clergy, even the military. All the peoples who are named here, some of them deceased, are prominent members of the Council on Foreign Relations. And you can see presidents on the left there, Nixon, Ford, Carter, Bush, Clinton. You see the team that President Obama has put in to get us out of the recession. Geithner, Volcker. Wolfowitz is the head of the World Bank. He He's licking his chops, waiting for the US dollar to completely implode. Right? And then you see the Republican alternative, John McCain, and Republican Condoleezza Rice, and Republican Dick Cheney, and Republican Olympia Snow, and Republican Colin Powell, and Robert Gates. And then if you turn on your TV, you're going to get the news from Katie Couric. Yeah. And you'll soon get it from Diane Sawyer. Unfortunately, we see generals on these lists of Council on Foreign Relations. General Stanley McChrystal's been in the news. General George Petraeus has been in the news. They're there. Supreme Court Justices Ruth Bader Ginsburg and Stephen Breyer. The man who finances everything left he can find, George Soros. Rupert Murdoch, the head of Fox News. How long do you suppose Fox News is going to be putting out decent information? In the religious world, you have Rick Warren, the famous preacher out in Southern California, and Father Theodore Hesburgh, the longtime head of Notre Dame University. Right? And you wonder why Notre Dame would have that scoundrel come and speak at their campus. Now you know. Right? These people are committed to destroying national independence and building the New World Order. But according to some former members of the organization, they've blown the whistle. In the early 1960s, a veteran American diplomat and former U.S. ambassador to several nations in South America, his name was Sproul Braden. He tried to inject some sanity into the Council on Foreign Relations. He was a member, and he found himself stymied and shunned, so he went and joined the John Birch Society. Right. Let's talk here a little bit about the Council on Foreign Relations. The Carter administration boasted, the CFR did, that they had 284 CFR members in the government. In the Reagan administration, they said 313. In the Bush the first, they had 382. Clinton, 548. Bush, the second Bush, 516. What about now? Well, CFR today, they boast 379, but he hasn't finished naming all the people that he's got in his administration. It's made up of 1,198 business leaders. The corporate socialists is what I like to call them. 362 journalists and media executives, which is why we have a New American Magazine, which is different from what they put out. 256 university and college administrators, and 793 professors, right? Professors. Woo-hoo. Admiral Chester Ward was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for quite a few years. He's a former Judge Advocate General of the United States Navy. And he finally had enough. And he came out, he said that the organization's goal was the submergence of U.S. sovereignty and national independence into an all-powerful one-world government. The most powerful clique in these elitist groups have but one objective in common, he said. They want to bring about the surrender of sovereignty and national independence of the United States. Right? We're grateful to Admiral Ward, who said that before he passed away. In April 1974, Foreign Affairs magazine, the journal of the Council on Foreign Relations, published the article by Richard N. Gardner called The Hard Road to World Order. In it, he said that we must perform an end run around national sovereignty, eroding it piece by piece. Now, how many members of the Council on Foreign Relations read that and resigned from the organization? Would you believe none? None. They should have. The current president of the Council on Foreign Relations, a man named Richard Haas, right? He told an audience recently, for 350 years, sovereignty has provided the organizing principle of international relations. The time has come to rethink this notion. Scrapping sovereignty, of course, means tearing up the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution. The CFR and other groups working to cancel our nation's independence and bring on world government protest that they're merely think tanks. No positions are ever taken. No policy recommendations are ever suggested. Many have disputed this self-serving claim, but in July 2009, Secretary of State Hillary Clinton spoke at the new branch of the Council on Foreign Relations in Washington, D.C. Look what she said. We get a lot of advice from the Council, so this will mean I won't have as far to go to be told what we should be doing and how we should think about the future. Our nation's Secretary of State goes to the CFR to be told what to do and how to think. She said so. Mrs. Clinton's frankness will undoubtedly bring her a scolding. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've covered a lot of ground here. We know that individuals require varying amounts of evidence to convince them of the worth of any claim. The John Birch Society believes that a conspiracy has a grip on our nation and it must be exposed and routed if our nation is to endure. Some viewers of what we're saying here tonight will agree, no doubt. Others might need more evidence. And we confidently claim that there's plenty of evidence available. For those who want more evidence, there you go. The evidence table is in the back of the room. Some DVDs, it's all there. Now, before we close, there's a need to answer two questions. Frequently, we are asked why some individuals over the centuries would devote a lifetime of effort to building a tyrannical new world order when they knew that their goal would not be achieved in a lifetime. And the answer is that the reward for them was in the building. They received favors while doing the work of the conspiracy, favors that included powerful positions and access to personal wealth and eerie satisfaction that comes from secretly manipulating world events and the destiny of millions. Right? That was their reward. The other question that we get often is, does the Illuminati still exist today? And that's a good question. And the answer is we don't know for sure. What we do know is that it or something exactly like it exists and is working for the goal established by Adam Weishaupt 200 years ago. The need to remove its power over our government and our way of life is absolutely essential. And it can be done if enough Americans decide to do it. So there's a great deal at stake. If the John Birch Society is wrong, Americans have little to worry about. If we're correct, then the sensible course of action is to get involved in our work of exposing and routing this conspiracy before it's too late. It can be broken up by exposure. We've covered a lot of ground in this presentation, mostly explaining how our country has been brought to its present perilous position. What then is the plan to reverse what is being done? You have a right to say, okay, what's your plan? John Birch Society's answer is that a conspiracy can be defeated through exposure. What is being done by America's leaders is not stupidity, and it's not that they are unknowing. We are being victimized by a deliberate campaign, a conspiracy. Now, once aware of this hugely important distinction, what happens to the ordinary person? A person who decides that, yes, it's a conspiracy, sees self-preservation kick in. That's the highest instinct in man. The problems aren't going to be solved by leaders being persuaded to correct their errors. They aren't making errors. They're implementing plans. The problems aren't going to be solved by supplying them with better information. They already know what you and I know, and they won't be turned away from their destructiveness by good information. We can, however, take our country back through the House of Representatives. The Constitution says all bills for raising revenues shall originate in the House. If the House won't initiate a measure to fund foreign aid, unconstitutional war, education, housing, medicine, so much more, that's it. There's nothing the Senate, the President, the Supreme Court can do about it. The Constitution, all bills for raising revenue shall originate in the House. The power of the purse is in the House. Most politicians have as their main goal getting reelected. Now let's suppose that in the year 2010, we get 8 or 10 or 12 more hardcore constitutionalists elected to Congress. What will happen? The momentum will shift. And many of the fence sitters, those who just want to get reelected, are going to say, well, this may happen in my district. I better start going this way instead of that way. There are people who say, you can't reelect 220, which would be a majority in the Congress. No. No, all we have to do is shift the momentum. And it can be done. Strong pressure from back home can even make patriots out of some self-servers. What does the plan entail? Inform ourselves on principles and issues. Understand the enemy. Educate and activate our friends. Grow membership in your congressional district. Train leaders and build chapters in the communities. Change the voting record or change the congressman. Restore constitutional government and maintain vigilance for generations yet to come. That's the plan. This is our plan. We ask you to join with us in this epic undertaking. Being a member of our society means you won't be easily misled by some smooth-talking faker because you'll be well informed. You won't be led into thinking that stupidity and ignorance are the root causes of our nation's problems. You'll be guided with accurate information and analysis. You'll be cautioned against accepting and then spreading the many rumors that are designed to steer you off on some tangent and get you to discredit yourself. And you'll be part of an organization that 50 years of experience and a growing number of successes. You'll be part of a nationwide concentrated effort to awaken and mobilize the sleeping giant, the many God-fearing and patriotic Americans who are concerned but don't know where to turn. The country is waiting for the John Birch Society in places where it doesn't already exist. You folks are fortunate. It exists here, and you can be a part of it, and then you can get your relatives in Kansas or wherever to become part of it as well. Concentration of effort is extremely important. We know that for every 50 persons, there's 50 pet peeves. And if everyone fights only what bothers him or her, nobody gets anywhere. When you join the Birch Society, you'll be working shoulder to shoulder on the same issues with the good members up in Maine and Florida and Oregon and Texas and Minnesota and Arizona and all across this country. What you do will help them, and what they do will help you. Concentration of effort is essential. Don't ever forget that history is made by the dedicated few for good or for evil. Let's make it good. So we say to you, join with us. Sign up for a subscription to The New American. There's no other magazine like it. No other magazine like it. None even comes close. And then you pray hard as if it all depends on God, while you work hard as if it all depends on yourself at the same time. Ladies and gentlemen, we have a moral obligation to oppose evil. Evil will triumph if not opposed. Conspiracy must be exposed or it will achieve its terrible goals. We have an obligation as American citizens to protect the American system from all enemies, foreign and domestic. And finally, whether we were born here or relocated to America in order to enjoy the benefits of living in this wonderful country, all of us owe it to the children of today and to generations yet to come to pass it on. Pass on this legacy of freedom earned for us by brave and far-seeing individuals 200+ years ago. The challenge is there, the opportunity for good is there, and the need is certainly there. I'll close with a quotation from Mark Twain, one of America's greatest sons. More than 100 years ago, Mark Twain said, "In the beginning of a change, the patriot is a scarce man, and brave, and hated and scorned. When his cause succeed, the timid join him, for then it costs nothing to be a patriot." I know there are many truly brave patriots in our country who don't intend to wait until success makes it easy to stand up for freedom. And finally, we go back to Robert Welch, the man who started our society. I had the privilege of working alongside him for many years. In 1975, he said, there is a conspiracy at work as sure as there is a law of gravity. Could you be more simple? Could you say it more simply? And to try to overcome its effects by ignoring its existence is exactly the kind of opposition that the conspiracy has contrived and created for itself. So we stand solidly on our position that the only way to stop this conspiracy is to expose it. And many, many times after he finished the speech, he would end up by saying, come join us in our proud companionship and in our epic undertaking, which is my wish as well. Thank you very much. God bless all. God bless America.